Church, I've told you already we're in Judges chapter 9. So let's turn there if you haven't already done so. We're going to have a big chunk of text that we're going to read. And as I preach it, I'm probably not going to be going through every verse. So even as I read it to you before we get into the text, I may stop along the way and mention a few things. Maybe, we'll see. But tonight I want to talk to you about the question, who is the rightful king of Israel? The Jewish people at this point, especially in Shechem and the area surrounding it, had chosen a king. This king was not one that God chose, though. God was to rule Israel. God was to be the sovereign over his people. And if you can think about this in terms of our nation, the same thing that was true for them can be said about us. Who is to be Lord of America? Or you can even break it down into smaller groups. Who is to be Lord of your family? Or even on an individual basis. Who is to be Lord of your life? Who is the rightful king of you, of your family, of your nation, of any group you're a part of? The answer obviously would be Jesus. It would be the triune Godhead. And what these people had done is they'd chosen a different king. They'd chosen a different Lord, and it was going to have consequences for them. But what you're going to find is that God does not abdicate his throne nor his right to rule. So when a rival king rears his head, you're going to find that eventually that head's going to get chopped off. And God has his way of working and bringing that about. And so with that in mind, let's read how God begins to show himself strong on behalf of his people and his nation to show who the real rightful king of Israel is. The Bible says, now Abimelech, verse 22, Judges 9. Now Abimelech ruled over Israel 3 years. Then God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the men of Shechem. And the men of Shechem dealt treacherously with Abimelech, so that the violence done to the 70 sons of Jerubbaal, and remember Jerubbaal is another name of a man called Gideon. The 70 sons of Jerubbaal might come, and their blood might be laid on Abimelech their brother, who killed them, and on the men of Shechem, who strengthened his hands to kill his brothers. The men of Shechem set men in ambush against him on the tops of the mountains. And they robbed all who might pass by them along the road. And it was told to Abimelech. So Abimelech's supposed to be ruling, and if you're the ruler, you're probably going to get some money from people that are paying to use the roads and the trade routes. And these people are now making him look bad and embarrassing him. He's not able to defend these traders that are coming through. They're getting robbed, so there's an issue there. Verse 26, now Gaal, the son of Ebed, came with his relatives. He crossed over into Shechem, and the men of Shechem put their trust in him. They went out into the fields and gathered the grapes of their vineyards, and they trod them and held a festival. They went into the house of their God, and they ate and drank and cursed Abimelech. Abimelech, remember, is the man who was supposed to be their king. Then Gaal, the son of Ebed, said, who is Abimelech? Who is Shechem, and that we should serve him? Is he not the son of Jerubbaal, and is Zebul not his lieutenant? Serve the men of Hamor, the father of Shechem. But why should we serve him? Would therefore that this people were under my authority, then I would remove Abimelech. And he said to Abimelech, increase your army and come out. Now Abimelech's not there, so he's just talking into the air. He's running his mouth, that's what he's doing. But they're all drunk and having a big drunken party. And so that's what drunks do. They run their mouth. When Zebul, the ruler of the city, heard the words of Gaal, the son of Ebed, his anger burned. He sent messengers to Abimelech deceitfully, saying, behold, Gaal, the son of Ebed, and his relatives have come to Shechem, and behold, they're stirring up the city against you. Now therefore arise by night, you and the people who are with you, and lie in wait in the field. In the morning, as soon as the sun is up, you shall rise early and rush upon the city. And behold, when he and the people who are with him come out against you, you shall do to them whatever you can. So Abimelech and all the people who were with him arose by night and lay in wait against Shechem in 4 companies. Now Gaal the son of Ebed went out, stood at in the entrance of the city gate, and Abimelech and Abimelech and the people who were with him arose from the ambush. When Gaal saw the people, he said to Zebul, "Look, people are coming down from the tops of the mountains." Zebul said to him, "You're seeing the shadow of the mountains as if they were men." Gaal spoke again. He said, "Behold, people are coming down from the highest part of the land, and one company comes by the way of the diviner's oak." Then Zebul said to him, "Where is your boasting now, which you said, 'Who is Abimelech that we should serve him?' Is this not the people whom you despised? Go out now and fight with them." So Gaal went out before the leaders of Shechem, and he fought with Abimelech. Abimelech chased him, and he fled before him, and many fell wounded up to the entrance of the gate. Then Abimelech remained at Arumah, but Zebul drove out Gaal and his relatives so that they could not remain in Shechem. Now it came about the next day that the people went out to the field, and it was told to Abimelech. So he took his people and divided them into 3 companies. Sounds like what his daddy Gideon did. And he lay in wait in the field, and when he looked and saw the people coming out from the city, he arose against them and slew them. Killed a lot of people that day. Also sounds a lot like his daddy. Then Abimelech and the company who was with him dashed forward and stood in the entrance of the city gate. The other 2 companies then dashed against all who were in the field and slew them. Abimelech fought against the city all that day, and he captured the city and killed the people who were in it. Then he razed the city and he sowed it with salt. When all the leaders of the tower of Shechem heard it, they entered the inner chamber of the temple of El-Berith. It was told Abimelech that all the leaders of the tower of Shechem were gathered together. So Abimelech went up to Mount Zalmon, he and all the people who were with him, and Abimelech took an axe in his hand, and he cut down a branch from the trees, and he lifted it and laid it on his shoulder. Then he said to the people who were with him, "What you've seen me do, hurry and do likewise." That sounds a little bit like Gideon too. That's what he told his people. Watch me and do what I do. All the people who also cut down each one his branch and followed Abimelech and put them on the inner chamber and set the inner chamber on fire over those inside. So they're all up in this tower. They get around and set a fire on this tower, and everybody inside is about to get burned up. So that all the men of the tower of Shechem also died, about 1,000 men and women. It's a lot of people. Then Abimelech went to Thebes, and he camped against Thebes, and he captured it. But there was a strong tower in the center of the city, and all the men and women with all the leaders of the city fled there and shut themselves in. And they went up on the roof of the tower. So Abimelech came to the tower, and he fought against it, and approached the entrance of the tower to burn it with fire. So it worked before, he's going to try it again. But a certain woman threw an upper millstone, that would have been the smaller of the stones when they ground out their grain, threw an upper millstone on Abimelech's head, crushing his skull. Then he called quickly to the young man, his armor bearer, and said to him, "Draw your sword and kill me, so that it will not be said of me, 'A woman slew him.'" So the young man pierced him through, and he died. When the men of Israel saw that Abimelech was dead, each departed to his home. Thus God repaid, I underlined that in my Bible, God repaid the wickedness of Abimelech, which he had done to his father in killing his 70 brothers. Also, and I underline these next 2 words, God returned all the wickedness of the men of Shechem on their heads, and the curse of Jotham, the son of Jerubbaal, came upon them. That was a lot to read, preacher, I know it. Told you it was a big passage to swallow. But let's talk about it for just a minute. You had the men of Shechem who at one point said, "I want a different ruler and I want a different God." They set up a false place of worship in their city to Baal, and they chose to turn their back on the sons of Gideon and chose instead Abimelech. Abimelech said, I want to be the ruler. You know, a lot of people, they don't want God to be their ruler. They don't want Jesus to be their ruler. They want to rule their own life, and they want, if they can, to rule over others. Well, Abimelech's like that. So Shechem didn't want God to rule them. And Abimelech didn't want God to be the ruler. But God is the God who made all of heaven and earth. He is the rightful ruler of all of creation. And again, I'll say it, God has not abdicated his throne. God doesn't take a vacation, and he is sovereign, and he is in control. So what is God going to do when there are people who say, I don't want God ruling over me? This is my land, my people, my nation, my life. Well, eventually it's going to go real bad for you. Sometimes it goes really bad in the next life, for sure. And I might say, maybe we might think only in the next life for some, but very often God acts in this life. Some people think that God is waiting to judge us after we die, but God judges all the time. And sometimes God brings his judgment in ways that we don't expect. In fact, you'll see in verse 22, it says Abimelech ruled over Israel for 3 years. 3 years, things went smooth for him. He didn't think anything was wrong. And that's a little discouraging for us sometimes, because God, who is sovereign and in control and who rules, when people get out of line, what we would like is for God to fix the problem immediately, wouldn't we? So you can imagine if you're in Israel and you're somebody that loves God and wants to worship God and wants God to be Lord over Israel, when you see an evil man come to power, come into a high place of government, you would think, God, I sure would like you to move that person out of the way for me and for us, because this nation would be in a whole lot better shape if you did. But God has his reasons and God has his timing, and sometimes God takes his time. But as I've told you many times, God is long-suffering, but he does not suffer forever. He will eventually do something. I think about, for instance, somebody like Saddam Hussein. He ruled for decades, didn't he? But eventually he got in his little rat hole down there where American soldiers found him, and they hung him in the end. His own people did. Eventually, it was payday. Payday comes someday. And so God has allowed Abimelech to rule for 3 years. God has been patient, but now the time is up. You remember last week we saw that a curse was made. And the curse was a warning, in a sense, that Jotham, another son of Gideon, made. He said, you let this guy rule over you, and his fire is going to come out of him, and it's going to begin to consume you. That's exactly what we see happen in this text. The Bible says in verse 23 how God begins to work. It says, God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the sons of Shechem. Now, this is a very interesting thing and maybe a little bit troublesome for some people. Let's camp here for just a minute and think about this. God sent an evil spirit. Now, I like the way, I think it was Martin Luther said it, way back 500 years ago. He said something like this: he may be the devil, but he's still God's devil. That's true. A good maybe reference or an idea for us to think about here would be what takes place in the beginning of the book of Job, where the devil comes and asks God for permission to do something. The devil is evil, and you don't ever want the devil working in your life. But there are times when God will allow the devil to do certain things. In fact, I would say it really this way: the devil can't do anything unless God allows him to. He is, in a sense, on a leash. God will place a boundary there, place a line there, and say, if you want to act, and God does this because it's according to his will and his plan and his purpose, and God's doing something, but God will say you can go, but God will also say you can only go so far. The devil can do what God allows him to do and no more. So I would think that the devil had a desire to work to destroy these people, because the devil hates everybody that's made in God's image, all of God's creation. And so if the devil says, well, there's a place where I can act and work, and gets permission from God, then he's going to go to work. And so if God says to the devil, you can go, then in a sense, wouldn't it be like saying God sent him? That's what it says here in verse 23. Now, when we think about the devil working, let me just remind you of a few things. Number one, sometimes people will say something like this: the devil made me do it. No, the devil doesn't make you do anything. The devil can tempt you. The devil can work in your life. The devil can entice you. But you will make the choice. If the devil's working to sway you a certain way, then in the end it's going to be your choice. But another thing I want to warn you about is the idea that some people have that I hear pretty frequently, which is every time something bad goes wrong, they blame it on the devil. Oh, that devil, my tire's flat. Well, maybe the devil made your tire flat. Maybe you ran over a nail. Some people blame the devil for anything and everything, and I don't know that the devil's in anything and everything, but I really find it's probably the opposite in America, which is I think sometimes we should see with spiritual eyes and recognize the devil working when we don't. In other words, I think sometimes there are some things we should give him credit for that we don't. Now, you think about what we're talking about here, and because I'm going somewhere with this. You had a nation who turned its back on God, began to worship a false god, and began to say, I don't want God to rule over me. And God, as a judgment against that nation, sent an evil spirit. What did the evil spirit do? They started fighting with one another. Isn't that what it says? The men of Shechem dealt treacherously with Abimelech. Verse 23, an evil spirit was sent between Abimelech and the men of Shechem. Now you've got groups fighting with each other. Now here's the question. Has God changed? Is God the same yesterday, today, and forever? In other words, if you ever see God do something in the Bible in the past, it's almost a guarantee, you can take it to the bank. What God's done before, He'll do again. It's basically a promise. God's faithful. He is consistent. And if God will see a nation that turns its back on Him, walks away from Him, and begins to live in an evil sort of way, as part of God's judgment, one of the things God can and does do is send an evil spirit, or sometimes evil spirits, which bring division and conflict and fighting. Now, does that sound like something that may be going on even today? Yeah. Does it seem like the devil is at work? I think so. And I don't think many people recognize it. I think they think it's politics or it's preference, but we could act like grown-ups and get along and disagree, but that's not what's going on. In America, we seem to be in the same place they were. They are fighting and fussing and dissatisfied, discontent, grumbling, complaining. And one of the things that we need to be mindful of is this: the longer things go, the worse it's going to get. And if God's judgment comes as a result of sinful activity, then the longer we go and the worse it gets, the more we can say that we've invited what comes. Listen to what 2 Timothy chapter 3 says. Beginning in verse 1, just listen to this. Realize this, the Apostle Paul writes, that in the last days, difficult times will come. Men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, revilers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, malicious gossips, without self-control, brutal, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding to a form of godliness, although they have denied its power. They'll say God, God, God. They'll even say Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. They hold to a form of godliness, but they invite the judgment of God and the wrath of God upon their lives as individuals. And nations invite God's wrath. And groups invite God's wrath, like a family. How many times did you see Jesus casting out demons in the New Testament? He did that a lot, didn't he? I have, and this isn't an original opinion of mine, but I have an idea, and I think it's probably true, that especially when you see demons getting cast out by Jesus from children, there's something going on in that family that brought that demon in. There are things you can do that will open yourself up to demonic activity. I used to know guys in high school that would listen to what is maybe called death metal music. They would sit around and do drugs and cut the lights off and sit in dimly lit rooms with smoke filling the air and listen to people that were satanic, admittedly so, that made these albums or records or whatever, and they would listen to this music, and they were inviting the devil into their lives. But same thing's true for others. You begin to act evilly, and think about where this nation is in the book of Judges. After rebelling against God, they've got this false place of worship where they're now worshiping Baal once again. They've turned their back on God, and basically they've embraced the devil. They're hugging on them, loving them, saying, we want you, we don't want God. Now, if that's what you want, God's going to give you that to you. He's going to allow it. That's what's happening in this time that we're reading about. They said we don't want God, that we want our idol. And remember that another thing I believe it was Martin Luther said, our hearts are idol factories. We will always create something within our heart that we love more than God, that we pursue more than God, that we live for more than God, that we glorify more than God. Something comes before God. People put sports before God, they put their job before God, they put money before God, they put their families before God. I mean, you just name it. There's a whole list of things you could come up with that people prefer above God. Our hearts are idol factories, but in the end of 1 John, he reminds us of this. Every idol, behind every one of them is a demon. And so he warns us in 1 John, keep yourselves from idols. You have to watch your heart. You have to guard it. And here it is that these people are embracing an idol, and behind every idol is what? A demon. And so you invite the devil into your life. I do think that drugs are a good way to bring the devil into your life. In fact, I also think addiction very often, one of the reasons it's very, very hard to break is I believe sometimes there's demonic activity behind it to entice you, to woo you, to go back into that thing that you wanted to be free of if you're addicted. So there's a spiritual warfare sometimes waging in addition to maybe a physical battle in your flesh that pulls it. These people had been sent an evil spirit by God. It was a judgment of God against his own people. Well, against Shechem, and Shechem was probably mostly Canaanite, but some Jewish probably, and the surrounding areas were Jewish. But never forget that God always does what's right. And so when God does this, it's the right thing to do, to allow it to happen, because God's working to bring about a better place and to bring about the judgment against Abimelech and Shechem for all the evil they had done. Their choices invited demonic activity. We need to be careful that we don't fall in the same trap. Guard ourselves from idols, Jesus as Lord, and for our nation, do everything we can to live for God and to have a godly nation. What we also see here in verse 23 is that, and goes into verse 24, it says, the men of Shechem, they dealt treacherously with Abimelech, which means they turned from integrity and they turned from truth. And it says that, and they did it, that God was doing this so that the violence done to the 70 sons of Jerubbaal might come, and that their blood might be laid on Abimelech, their brother, who killed them, and the men of Shechem, who strengthened his hands to kill his brothers. So in case you missed it or don't know the story, you weren't here maybe or forgotten, Shechem's a town that was mostly Canaanite and paganized, and they had a place of worship there for Baal, a false god. And they went to the temple when Abimelech tempted them, and they got the money out of the treasury, 70 pieces of silver, and they gave it to Abimelech and said, go and do what you need to do. He hired worthless men, and they went and slew. He had 70 brothers, killed them all. Because he said, I'll rule over you and I'll be your king, I'll be your Lord, and I don't want any threats to my throne. And so he wiped them all out, all of his brothers. He killed them. Now, God has taken up this cause and said, I'm going to avenge this blood that's been shed. And I'm placing the blame where? At the men that paid for it to happen, as well as the man who actually brought it about. You know, there's a warning that goes all the way back to Genesis 9 when Noah, after God flooded the earth, came off the ark. This is what God said. Surely I'm going to require your lifeblood. From every beast I'll require it. And from every man whom every man's brother I will require the life of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man. So any nation that pays for death to kill one of God's creations that's made in his own image, a human being that is innocent, has done nothing worthy of death, invites God's wrath and invites God's judgment. We are a nation that had thousands of murders last year. The number I saw online today was over 16,000. We abort more babies than that. That's the biggest killer in America. And by the way, our tax dollars pay for it. There's assisted suicides that go on now, and suicides, and just all sorts of ways that man is killing man. God takes that seriously. And God invites judgment. It invites the judgment of God every time that it happens. And the compounding effect of it all, when the floodgates open and judgment comes, it's not going to be pretty. And I've heard it said this way too, by the way. And and you need to hear this. Some might say this, because we abort babies, God's judgment is going to come. The truth is, the fact that God has let us do it is the judgment of God against us. The fact that God would let us kill our own children and not stop us. When God said, go your own way, you can do what you want to do, and we do it. That is the judgment of God. And it invites more of the judgment of God. And so God judges this man as an individual, and he also judges these people, Shechem, as a town, as a city-state, as it were. And again, another warning, America should pay attention. It should be careful. Because we are, as we said Sunday morning, a shaky people on shaky ground. And it can get much worse. So, when we continue to see what happened here, the men of Shechem, they set an ambush against these people on the tops of the mountains. And so they're doing some foolish things. And then now, as they've started to enrich themselves by stealing and robbing and murdering on this mountain pass, now it's time to bring in the grape harvest. And they harvest their grapes, and they have a big festival or a feast, a drunken feast, as it were. It says they went to the house of their God, and they ate and they drank and they cursed Abimelech. This is verse 27. But now let me remind you, when it says they go to their house of their God and they worship, you, without being too graphic, when you get drunk and you worship the god of Baal, you're having a sex orgy. That's what they're doing. And so they're running their mouth and they're talking about their king Abimelech. And so now the evil spirit that's working in their lives is causing all sorts of stuff. And God sovereignly lets these curses get overheard. God allows this man Gaul to come in and to begin to run his mouth as well. He says, well, why don't you let me be the king instead of this guy? And remember, Abimelech, when he came to power, he used the race card. He said, well, I'm one of y'all. Why don't you let me rule you instead of these other guys? Because he was half Jewish, half Canaanite, it would seem. And this guy says, well, he's half Jewish, so I'm more like one of you. Let me take over instead of him. And so the thing that happened before happens again. You'll find that with a lot of people, especially people that are full of sin and evil. The things they've done before give you a clue as to how they're going to act later on. Before they didn't like Gideon and Gideon's sons, and now here's Abimelech. Well, they don't like him later on. I mean, isn't that how it goes? People make choices, if you let them, about who their leader is going to be, and they make it based on, well, what's in it for me? What do I get out? Not what's best for the nation, not who's a righteous man or a woman of God that's going to lead the nation in truth and righteousness and good. Who is it that's going to go into politics and do the right thing even if it costs them? Nobody wants to do that today. Well, I might lose my job. They might vote me out. Well, if it means you're going to do the wrong thing to stay in office, then get voted out. Do the right thing. These people are saying, well, we put this guy in charge of Shechem and we let him be king, but now it hasn't gone for us the way we thought it was going to go. So the economy is not as good as we thought it was going to be. We need more jobs, and this guy's playing the race card. Well, I'm one of you. And now there's drinking and arrogance and bragging and slick talk. And so Shechem rebelled, just like they rebelled before against Gideon's son. They're rebelling against the last son, Abimelech. And just like before, when Gideon's sons were all killed, now what God's going to bring about is everybody in Shechem is going to get killed. The funny thing is that when this thing starts to go down, it seems like at the first battle, when Gaul sees the shadows coming down from the mountains and turns out it's a flood of people coming down to wreck this city, that it seems like after the first day, they might have thought in Shechem, well, this thing's over now. He's fought all the people that were going to stand against him, and we're done. But you can't trust a man. If there's a man that comes to power through evil means, especially a man like this who would kill 70 of his brothers, once he gets a taste for blood, he's not going to stop. So the next day, after the battle's over, what does he do? He comes back again and he kills everybody. He fights against the people that would fight against him the first day, but the next day he's going to take vengeance on the city, the people that were cursing, the people that were robbing these places on the mountaintops, these traitors, the people that were rebelling against his rule. I guess what I'm trying to say is that sometimes people who are ambitious and double-crossers and bring destruction, you need to watch them, because what they did before, they'll do again. There's an old saying in church, whatever you do to get people, is what you got to do to keep them. And I guess the same thing would be true for anybody that comes to power. Whatever you got to do to come to power is what you got to do to stay in power. And it seems like what he had to do to come to power is kill a lot of people, and what he's got to do to stay in power is the same sort of thing. Well, I'm almost out of time, but I'm almost out of things to run my mouth about anyway. So let's go ahead and shoot ahead, and let's think about this thing for a minute. Here it is that this man came to power. He came to a throne and became king over Israel. In a sense, he's the first king in Israel. 3 years he ruled. Remember the words of Jesus, what good does it do a man to gain the whole world and lose your soul? What good does it do him? Because now we're over 2,000 years removed, probably way more than that. He's been in hell all this time. What good did those 3 years do him? God's judgment came against him. The curse of God came upon him. The curse that his half-brother mouthed eventually came to pass. Here's a man that the Bible said, we read it last week, slew his brothers on one stone. And then you get to the end of this chapter, what does it say? A woman slays him with one stone. In fact, if you remember when Gideon was going to battle, his daddy, that I told you that people in this day and time, especially kings, to them it was very important how you died. Uh, this man does not want to be known as one that was slain by a woman. But if you keep reading in the Bible, you know they're talking about him years and years and years later. It's in the book that Samuel wrote. And you know what they're saying about him even later on? A woman slew him. To them, that would have been not a very noble thing for a great king to be killed by a lady. But he was. So all that he worked for, all that he wanted to accomplish, all that he wanted to bring about, it was all for nothing. God brought everything to pass against Shechem, wiped that city out. Abimelech sowed it with salt, which means like when you sow a field with salt, it's not going to be any good anymore. And he killed everybody there. And again, he got a taste for blood, didn't he? Why did he go on to this next town, Thebes? You know, we're not told why he went there. When it says in verse 50, he goes on to the next city. Maybe they were aligned with Shechem. Who knows? But he thought that he was going to be able to do to them what he did to others, and God brought it to an end. The Bible says in verse 56, God repaid. God repaid the wickedness of Abimelech. Verse 57, it says, God returned the wickedness of the men of Shechem. When people do evil things, God sees, God knows. And when God's ready in God's timing, God acts. You don't want to be on the wrong side of God. Remember that our salvation came because God sent His Son to live a life we could not live, to die a death that we deserve. And on the cross, He became a curse for us. He took our curse upon Himself as He hung there on the cross. We would be in the same boat that all these people are in I just read about. Whether it's Shechemites or Abimelech, we would all be under the curse of God had Jesus not taken our curse for us. Jesus died in our place to pay our debt, rose again from the grave to set us free from this. We need to learn from this, to learn how God works, how God thinks, how God acts, what God does. We need to know that God is sovereign even over the evil, that God reigns it in, controls it in a sense, without being the cause of it. Without doing anything wrong, God can allow it and send it. But in the end, God's going to wipe it all out, and He does it because of Jesus. So thanks be to God that set us free and gave us victory over sin and evil. And we don't ever have to fear the curse of God. Let's pray together. Father, thank You for Your love, grace, and mercy. Thank You for a peace that passes all understanding. God, for showing us tonight what we need to see, that You're the God that judges nations and individuals, that sees when evil happens and brings about a bad end to all those who are against You, to everyone that chooses to reject You, to rebel against You, and to act in ways that You forbid. God, You punish, but You always do what is right. We thank You for being that kind of a God. We thank You for Your wisdom, Your sovereignty, and Lord, more than anything, we thank You for Jesus, that made it so that we would not have to live under a curse, but could be set free so that we might live with You forever. Jesus, we love You and thank You for all that You've done for us, and all You're doing, and all that You're going to bring about. In Your name we pray. Amen. God bless you, church. Have a good night.